As you can see, we have our various panelists. Dr. Marita Sen, the founder and director of research at Energy Aspects. Good to have you on board. Nick Allen of Control Risks, and Dr. Simon Evanet of the University of St. Gallen. Welcome on board. They've asked for this to, we're talking about the big picture, all right? Marie, you gave us the big picture economically, and you painted an impressive performance. This would be impressive, except it's not very large, the profit, is it? 30 billion across the amount, a yield, or so a margin of 3.1%. I could put the money in the bank and do better. Couldn't I?
Depends on where you live and which bank, but yeah.
So the core is, if this is the best of times, does it get better or do we go down?
Well, oh, what's that for me?
No, yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, I think it's a structural issue, really, to a very large extent, because the industry has always struggled to eke out significantly higher profit margins than these. I think the top of the range of net profit margins for the industry is in the vicinity of 5%. So, really, this is not bad given our past. But clearly, we have some long-standing structural issues that still weigh on us and hold back our profit-making potential.
Right, and the difficulty is that those issues, Nick, those issues, the problems are all there and getting bigger. And this is supposedly the best of times at the moment in terms of the recovery. So, Nick, what for you is the number one problem, the number one challenge?
So, I can give you three answers to that, although you asked for one. So, in the short term, I think and Marie mentioned this, I think conflict risk and outside just of the aviation industry, I think poses a real potential challenge. And when I say conflict, there's obviously war, but there's conflict currently between China and the United States, as an example. So I think, or what could happen in this region if Israel and Iran conflict heats up. In the medium term, I think supply chain disruption. Marie's already talked about that in terms of supply of air, or the CNN video, your video, talked about the supply of aircraft, yep. I think. And then in the third instance, I think the fragmentation we're seeing. So here we are at an IATA conference. IATA founded, I think I'm right, 1945, 80% of all the airlines. I would just say the things we think are fixed, and I'm quoting Michael Hayden here, who's Director General of the CIA in the US. The things we think are fixed are not as fixed as we think they are. And that fragmentation, I think, longer term is probably the biggest challenge for this industry.
But these have been around for a while, these issues. Are they worse?
Yes. They are worse. I think these are trends, you're right, they were picked up 5, 6, 7 years ago, made worse by the pandemic. I was promised post-pandemic a sort of 1920s, we were all going to be dancing. Hasn't really happened. I think all that fragmentation, nationalism, populism, has all been exacerbated by the pandemic. So it is worse, and I think it's a lot harder out there projecting forward. I think that's a real challenge for business.
Okay, but these are realities of life, Simon, that the industry has to deal with. Does it have a capacity to deal with? And we're going to break them down in just a minute into its constituent areas. But for the moment, if you take the list that Nick's just given us, there's not a lot you can do about it other than react. Well, you can prepare and react.
Yeah, well, being well prepared to react is not a bad thing. But what are you going to do if you're Air Baltic? You can't fly into Russia anymore. You've got to react. You've got to move around. These conflict scenarios we talked about, I think, are absolutely pertinent. I think we're quite likely to see an acceleration in regionalization of the global economy, especially if Donald Trump gets elected. Europe will abandon North America.
Do you consider Donald Trump's re-election to be one of the global risks for the aviation industry?
Yes. Yes. For the simple reason that I think the transatlantic alliance fragments if he gets re-elected. Europe will turn its back on North America. North America will turn inward. If you're running an airline in North America, the NAFTA agreement will be renegotiated to the benefit of the United States and to marginalize those Mexican factories which are all being built now. Yeah, no, I think Trump's re-election will be, or election would be, a very significant factor. It's not the only conflict-related thing we've got to worry about. We've got to worry about Russia possibly prevailing in Ukraine, and then let's get on to Taiwan later.
Can I just go home now, please?
Can I challenge the Trump?
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
The Trump view, because, and I'm not here giving sort of party political broadcasts for either side. I'm not an American citizen. Yeah. But Trump's previous presidency, if you're objective about it,
right,
lots of things he did were not bad for business. I think if you look at, Marie, you mentioned the biggest input for airlines is fuel. You will see huge increase in US drilling. From an environmental perspective, you might not like that. So from a fuel price perspective, you might. It increases fragmentation, probably. Is it the number one risk? I would challenge that.
Except we have sort of been forewarned of what might happen.
In terms of protectionism?
Yes.
Yes.
So we can't say we weren't told. I want to hear from everybody to start with. Essentially, all they're talking about, your fellow panelists, are various risks. But underlying them, of course, is that they all affect the cost of energy. And that's your area.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to what Nick said because I want to challenge him slightly on Trump raising.
Oh, don't start there, please. We're more interested in that.
US production is already at a record high. So I think it's complete. It's a very political point to say that Trump is going to come and actually raise production. It has been growing under Biden. If anything, yes, Biden has made permitting harder, but that hasn't had any impact whatsoever on near-term production. It's at 13.3 million barrels per day. We expect it to go to 13.7. I don't disagree that Trump is going to make it easier on a permitting basis, but the bigger challenge with US production is we are running out of what we would call sweet spots, right? The risk, if Trump comes to power, is going to be Iran, Venezuela. What does he do to international supplies? The Biden administration has completely turned a blind eye, and we're getting about 800,000 barrels per day more from Iran into the market.
Right.
So that's the offset. But in terms of what you were asking about oil prices, Marie mentioned as well, yes, OPEC's just come out overnight and extended their deal. There's a lot of complacency in the market right now. Yes, we do have a lot of spare capacity. Demand growth isn't great. But there is a pretty solid floor for crude prices. I would say for airlines in this audience, crude is irrelevant. It's really jet fuel. And that's where the crack spread, and that's where a lot of the challenges come in, because for all
Isn't this where clever hedging sort of does its magic?
Well, I don't think everybody here believes in hedging, and let's not even, that could be a whole session by itself. But yes, I think you are seeing, and there is definitely sophistication in that going on. Crude prices are becoming less and less relevant. It's the crack spread. We're shutting down refineries because everybody's concerned about emissions and peak oil demand. That's the problem. We're not producing enough diesel and jet fuel in the medium term. That's the thing airlines need to be very concerned about, on top of that SAF.
So not only are you saying, not only are we not producing enough SAF, anywhere near enough, we're not producing enough of the stuff we already need.
Or we will not be producing enough of the stuff we need, yes.
Yeah. Indeed, we're sort of not. We represent about 8% of refined output. Yeah, aviation.
The demand
takes. Yes, aviation takes about 8% of whatever the refineries are putting out, and that's not a small number necessarily, but it's not it doesn't make us a priority in the product mix. So we really have to fight for keeping our share of refined output, and we face fierce competition from the diesel people. Now, there's an opportunity here, of course, because if we think that cars are turning to electric, we should have an easier time of switching the diesel to jet going forward. And this should be the same for biorefineries, of course, as well in the future.
The problem is we've shut down 3.2 million barrels per day of refining capacity during COVID, globally, just in during the COVID years. And now, from next year onwards, we are shutting down, on average, about 1 million, if not more. By 2026, we are not adding any new capacity net. That's the problem. So if demand keeps growing...
So the effect is what? A rise in prices as dwindling demand increased, dwindling supply increased demand.
Yeah, so not crude oil, but for jet fuel and diesel, which is why the crack and that hedging really matters.
will there be enough?
Right here, right now, no.
So what happens? Tim decides he's not going to fly a few 380s.
Well, no, the prices go up and then you get the consumer to react.
But I think we're seeing a change, aren't we, in terms of all those projections around what was going to happen by 2050, which was a kind of big round number that people chose that was sufficiently far off. And you're seeing, the big energy companies talking much more about actually increasing carbon fuel production to fill this gap. And obviously, I know this all takes time. But you're right, the market will respond. I was listening to a presentation that Dangote made, CEO of Dangote, about refined fuel production in Africa and big plans for that. So I think the debate is shifting a little bit, and we're probably seeing a slightly more carbonized future than we were talking about 2 years ago. Not my area of expertise, and I know Amrita and others know more about it.
Yeah, thanks for letting me in here, because indeed, to what you said too, this year is predicted by the International Energy Agency to be the highest oil-producing year ever. Yeah, and all the restrictions on oil production were lifted, obviously, before the Ukraine war started.
Okay.
So
let's deal with geopolitical risk. The war in Russia, or the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, it rumbles got longer and longer. I can't believe I'm asking this, but if Russia prevails and succeeds in Ukraine, what does that do?
So the next step, then you go to Lithuania.
Sorry?
Lithuania is next. Why? It's unfinished business for the Russians. Even Gorbachev was cheesed off that the Lithuanian Communist Party left first when the Berlin Wall fell. Our German friends have announced that in 2027 they will have a full military brigade in Lithuania. So if Russia prevails in Ukraine in the next 12 months, they've got 2026 to get into Lithuania before the German brigade shows up. That's the timetable.
And you believe that is a realistic possibility that Russia goes against Lithuania?
Yes. Because it will absolutely...
You're not just being alarmist.
No, I think this is... they want to demonstrate that the NATO expansion after the fall of the Berlin Wall was utterly inappropriate and needs to be reversed. And this is how they do it.
I think it depends what we mean by Russia prevails, because I think you're talking a scenario where Ukraine falls to Russian forces. I think there's a more likely scenario where what Russia prevails means, and probably more likely in a Trump re-election, is Russia keeps Crimea, it keeps the bits of eastern Ukraine it's got, which have pretty much been destroyed, and we have a sort of frozen conflict. That keeps Ukraine out of any future NATO integration, because you can't join NATO if you've got a conflict going on. So I think what does Russia prevails mean is an important question. Whether they would go on to Lithuania, a NATO member?
But the level of uncertainty that would create would be quite dramatic.
It would initially, but look at the flexibility, particularly of this industry, how it deals with uncertainty. There's a shock. We've had frozen conflict in Georgia with, Abkhazia and South Ossetia for well over a decade. We're all kind of used to it. So, yes, but if it becomes the status quo, industry adapts, doesn't it?
I'm with Nick on this, but what I do want to highlight, bringing it back to my area of expertise, which is energy, we should not forget what Ukraine is doing already and probably will continue to do, which is attacking energy infrastructure. It has already upped its game, and now we've got drones, which have a massive, 3,000-kilometer range. It's attacking refinery after refinery. Russia has managed just about to keep things going. That's the biggest risk for this industry. Russia is one of the biggest exporters of diesel, feedstock material. Taking ports out, taking pipelines out, which could be the next step.
So we often don't... You're saying that the Ukrainian attacks, the drone attacks, are being more successful than perhaps many of us have reported.
No, I don't think it's been successful yet, in the sense Russia's managed to, bring refineries back up, but they are consistently going, and we also know President Biden has asked them not to go after infrastructure that would be inflationary. Now, if they think Trump's going to come to power, do we really think they're going to listen to Biden and not go after ports and pipelines? If they take out a big Russian port, that's a huge issue for oil markets.
The decision to allow, Nick, the decision to allow Ukraine to use weapons within Russia, or at least fired within certain parameters of those cities. You know what I mean, if I try to be too definitive, within the Kharkiv area. Is that a major development?
It's significant. I think it's kind of logical, isn't it? And there's a sort of gradual escalation going on here in terms of trying to deter Russia from doing more. So do I think it makes things worse? I don't think it really changes the status quo. There is what you're seeing is an attempt by Ukraine's supporters to hold Russia at the moment where it is. But I don't think, Simon, you probably agree, there's a scenario where Ukraine wins this war anytime soon.
Correct.
No. In the traditional definition?
In the traditional of kicking the Russian forces out of eastern Ukraine, and Crimea, I don't see that changing in my lifetime. But
so bringing it to the industry, the ability for overflight of Russia, for example, that is not coming back, in your view, Simon, in the foreseeable future?
No.
And we are going to have to learn to live with extra hours of flying this way, going over that way, or simply some routes that just aren't economic.
But this is a really good example of the flip side of risk, isn't it? So I'm flying to Shanghai from London in 2 weeks' time, and I'm flying China Eastern because it's 3 hours shorter each way.
Exactly.
So
I was going to say, except if you're Air China, they're allowed to fly over that route.
So it's just, there's always the opportunity.
Well, that raises, that was the valid question that was discussed at A4E, as to whether or not the EU should be stricter about those airlines. I mean, have we shot ourselves in the foot, in a sense, by penalising Western airlines who can't fly over and allowing others in, but basically having a rule that says, no, if you're flying to an EU airport, you can't fly over Russia?
That's geopolitical risk in action, isn't it?
Yeah. But I mean, that's the reality of it, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we can sit and pontificate about all this stuff, but the reality is, if you have got some IATA members who can fly and some who can't by it, then you are already embedding into the system an economic inefficiency.
Yes, and for the industry, of course, you're absolutely right, and for the global economy as well. I would say, I would be as bold as to say less flying, less growth, and less economic development for everybody. And somehow, mysteriously, it seems like we've forgotten that a bit, that throughout human history, it is trade and connectivity, mobility, all forms of connectivity, of course, not only aviation, but we are necessary but not sufficient, as we would say in economics, but I would emphasize necessary.
But, sorry, I know you're the moderator, but just quickly. This is the point about fragmentation, though, isn't it? Because it it devalues and undermines consensus. So the point I made about, I don't wish to predict the end of IATA, we're a long way from that. But you have fragmentation, don't you? Because there are winners and losers.
What do you mean by we have fragmentation?
So there are winners and losers. So the things that I grew up in my business career, the WTO, the EU as a Brit, being part of the EU, all these things, the role of the World Bank, all of that seemed to me the building blocks of the global order, to use a cliche. That is being pulled apart. And where you have winners and losers in a club who rely on the idea that everyone's on the same rules, that starts pulling apart because people feel it's unfair. And the point you just made, Richard, it is unfair, and I'm making economic choices to fly to China based on time and the rest of it because someone has an advantage. So I think that's where you see fragmentation in action.
I completely agree with Nick, and if you think about supply chain, which you mentioned in your video, look at the Red Sea, the issues that are going on here in this region. What that's doing is then trapping jet fuel, which this region has abundance of, to come to Europe. So if you look at the prices in Europe and the US of jet, of gasoline and diesel, is significantly higher now than the East because shipping costs have gone up so much. So it is fragmentation.
How much of this is worse than before? In an industry,
look, as Nick said, the global siders, the architecture of this stuff is going to pot. But it's going to pot. All the acronyms you mentioned, WTO, all the rest of it, IMF. But what is still quite strong, and in some cases getting stronger, is the regional initiatives. Look at how Africa is integrating. ASEAN hasn't given up the ghost at all. I mean, these are growth poles. Even Latin America understands they have an opportunity with critical raw materials if they could get their act together. So there are, I mean, at the regional level, things are still there. I know the EU is slow, but let's face it, for better or for worse, the van der Leyen administration has got more done in the last 4 years than in the previous 20. And so the regional stuff seems to be where the traction is.
But can the regional stuff have the necessary or sufficient effect that the global stuff had that's fragmented apart? Or do you end up, I mean, there's a reason why the global stuff was put together. No. Because it was more efficient and there was a consensus. If you start that fragmentation, which you're already saying it has, can it replace?
No. I mean, clearly going back where we were 20 years ago would be much more preferable. It's not on the cards, though. So the question is, how do you play in the regional markets you've got? And which of those regional markets can you tie together with the airline industry,
right.
I guess?
But if you're a global carrier...
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
If you're a global carrier,
yeah.
First of all, you have the issue of your nationality, you know, and what you've got to follow. And then you've got the sensibilities of the nationality vis-a-vis the other parts of the country. Which brings me to China and the US. Mm. And if there is a deterioration, if that's possible, in terms of trade and relations, there, what happens?
Well, look, I mean, it is...
Taiwan?
We can come to Taiwan, let's do that. But let's not forget, you know, where Trump was erratic, Biden has had method. And Biden is systematically shoring off parts of trade, tech relations, which are now off limits. And this, I think, will continue. And to the extent that the airlines are caught up in all of that, then this will be problematic. And then, of course, if our friend does get elected in November, we're talking about 60% tariffs on what's left, yeah? And 10%, by the way, on the rest of the world. That's what he wants to do. So, yeah, we're talking about a massive trade shock, but I think that's where North America really does turn inward. And let's not forget, by the way, China has been turning inward for the last 15 years anyway, with its dual circulation strategy. So the two biggest poles of economic activity in the world economy have given up on globalization, largely.
They have, but there was a study done just towards the end of last year by two US universities, I can't recall which, that showed that of goods manufactured in the United States, 97% had a Chinese component. Yeah. Could have been a switch, could have been... So that integration has been built. I think the Taiwan scenario is, you know, I think as Simon says, this is probably going to be an issue, but it's going to be gradual. And there are things, you know, if China declares sort of Taiwanese airspace, I think the term is a sort of air defense identification zone, that could be significant challenges. I think we are seeing these two, particularly in the technology sphere, countries move apart. You're having sort of technology blocks, I guess. And the risk for aircraft, I guess, is the secondary sanctions risk. And we've already seen that happening. Company here in the UAE last year being sanctioned for supplying parts that were heading into the Russian war machine. So it is going to have an impact, and it's in sort of possibly unexpected places.
If we took, yes.
No, but I was going to say, in terms of China-US, you've already seen Chinese passenger traffic hasn't recovered fully yet to international passenger traffic, and a big chunk of that is the US. I mean, goods-wise, I agree, there's a lot of manufacturing parts that continue to flow, but passenger traffic still hasn't, and I just don't see how that ever gets back, or for a long time gets back, to the pre-COVID levels, just because of the relationship between the two.
I was interested on SAF. I can't believe I used that in the same sentence. I sort of look at SAF and then I have a headache and need Nurofen because I don't really understand it. And one airline CEO I heard say yesterday, well, don't worry about it. You know, it'll all sort itself out. The targets will be missed, or this will happen, or that will happen. But we're making a fuss about, we're not making a fuss about nothing, but we're making a fuss. Do you agree?
I had a slide, if you allowed me to have a slide, I had a slide called What is SAF? It was pretty pictures, but anyway, I'll send it to you. I think that the issue is, you are exactly right. We are making a fuss. A lot of airlines have come up with, I guess, mandates, very, very high mandates. We just aren't going to produce enough of it. There's not enough biofuels around, especially
not airlines, yeah, countries.
Countries, yeah.
Airlines.
And then if the other sectors, say shipping and other industries, take away biofuels, you're not going to have enough of it.
But I was fascinated by your chart, Marie, that showed, the US the US system of credits is having a greater effect than Europe's
Corsia.
nonsense. And that will continue
Well, we can hope that the policy setting in Europe could evolve, yeah? You know, let's follow...
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, maybe a bit tad optimistic.
I was about to say.
I mean, our view on SAF very much is that it is going to be the US West Coast. It's going to be LCFS that drives the price of SAF. Everything else will be a differential to it. Because of the credit system, it does work. If you look at the offset mechanism, offsets are so much cheaper. The Corsia, the low carbon mechanism that Europe's proposing, that does not incentivize SAF because the SAF price is 10, 20 times more than just going for an offset mechanism, which is so much cheaper.
Well, although it's ICAO, yeah, Corsia is under ICAO, and we don't have enough of those credits, yeah.
Exactly, so it won't...
Is this system
so
just
the
too
cheap
bloody
argument falls apart if we don't have the supply, yeah.
Is it just too complicated?
No, I mean, I would say that, this is not a transportation issue. I feel that that's where I have the greatest frustration, maybe, yeah? That it's sort of treated as if this were an aviation and a transportation issue, although I would say that it's an economic development issue, and therefore it should concern every ministry in every government. And this is the most promising economic development strategy that we have. We can build new agricultural activities with which we can build new energy industries, with which we can fuel all our activities in the global economy with sustainable fuel, and that is, after all, the objective. And we want this to happen for all industries, including our own, and we want more renewable energy produced for everybody, and we want our share of that total output.
I think it's going to be extremely inflationary, because we just aren't investing enough. To what Nick was saying earlier as well, in terms of the more fragmentation you're going to get, policies are not talking to one another. Energy transition policy needs to be global. It can't be regional. And that's why you have arbitrage opportunities.
You said it's going to be inflationary.
Yeah.
Talk that through, please.
What you are seeing with energy transition, and we are now seeing energy companies just basically saying these targets, we can't meet them, so we're going to go back to kind of oil and gas and fossil fuels. But let's talk about carbon border adjustment.
Sorry?
Carbon border tax, which Europe is talking about, right? If you are importing a fuel that is more emitting, you're going to be taxed. Where does that go on to? You and I are going to pay for it. It's going to get passed on to the consumer.
But as I understand it, we're going to get screwed regardless, whether it's that particular tax,
right,
or whether it's the increased cost of SAF.
Right, that's my point.
Right, or whether it's the mandate penalty that the supplier is paying that then gets passed to the...
Or renewables, if you have only renewables without baseload gas, you have to pay for the intermittency. So now you have to pay for both for electricity prices. So everything in the energy transition system is extremely inflationary, and no government official in a democracy is willing to stand up and say, yes, that's the true cost of transition.
This is like because of what the former head of the Eurogroup said. The former head of the Eurogroup at the height of the Greek financial crisis. We all know what needs to be done. We just can't get re-elected if we do it.
Exactly.
So I mean, Amrita's absolutely right. And at some point, reality is going to have to intrude on these plans. So I know nothing about SAF, but I do know a little bit about the demand for critical minerals for battery production globally. It is impossible. There are not enough critical minerals to meet the potential demand for battery production if everyone follows the targets they happily published as to what was going to happen. It just cannot happen. And you're also seeing geopolitics affect that. So I'm sure everyone here has been following what's been going on in New Caledonia, which is a big nickel mining place. And the price of nickel has dropped precipitously, but that was meant to be a sort of strategic European reserve, because New Caledonia is French territory, and those mines are now economically unviable. So you're having geopolitics impact something. To Amrita's point, this needs to be done globally, and fragmentation is pulling it apart. So I agree entirely, and I've learned something about SAF as well, so there you go.
Oh, don't worry. I guarantee you the rules on SAF will have changed before this panel is over. I want to just circle to, if you are running an airline, starting with you, Simon, if you're running an airline, what would you say to somebody in this room running an airline that they need to keep their number one eye on?
The US election is the next big event. That's the thing. I mean, so much follows from this. I'm sorry. I would go that. I guess in the intermediate thing, we would look at your EU parliamentary elections, because this is where you'll get this first green backlash. So if you're talking about the concatenation of political factors,
yes,
it is all that stuff which is just going to build up.
And to stay with you, Sam, just to the extent that you can affect anything. I mean, I don't mean in terms of the result of the election, but to the extent that you, in terms of running around, what do you do? How do you prepare?
I think there's an understanding in Brussels that they've overreached.
Do you think there is?
Yes. And I think the sense I get is that they know they have to climb down from a tree, and they need sensible plans for how to climb down from a tree. The smarter companies I know, not in this industry, but there are other smart companies as well, are already preparing their plans to talk to Brussels, to offering them ways out. And that's what I would recommend doing.
I would actually, it's going to sound, it's a very boring answer, but for me, the biggest thing airlines need to look at and concentrate on is the downstream. What Nick said, yes, a lot of companies are now moving towards saying, okay, look, we're not going to meet any of these targets, we're going to increase oil and gas production. Downstream, unfortunately, isn't sexy. Nobody talks about refining. When have you done a show on refining, for instance, Richard? That's the problem. The problem is, that's what gives us jet fuel, gasoline, diesel. We are shutting down more and more of this, and that's
but we'll open it up again.
We won't, because if you want to meet your greenhouse gas emission reduction target, you shut down a refinery, you hit 50% of that.
So let's get to the cut to the chase here. You're not suggesting that suddenly we're not going to fly, or that suddenly airlines will reduce the number of flights.
All I'm saying is airlines need to work with governments to make them understand demand isn't going away overnight, which is what a lot of Western governments think. It's like, oh, because of the IATA and their views around 2030, 2050, if anything, demand continues to come in higher. To Marie's point, if you don't have economic growth, well, or rather, if you don't have energy, you can't have economic growth. So it's governments that are forcing almost government policy and shareholder policy that's forcing the shutdown of refineries. If we don't produce enough fuel, then the airline industry is going to face massive, a crush in margins because costs are going to go up.
And we'll end up paying more.
Yes.
If airlines had money, they should insource their fuel supply. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, that's a privilege reserved for the few, I guess, across our industry as a whole.
Right. Before we finish, in the room, is there a geopolitical risk we have not addressed? Just shout it out, I can hear. This is worrying. There's no geopolitical risk that we haven't thought about. Willie?
You've got them all.
We've got them all. So,
I can add one. Migration.
What? Don't throw that in now. Migration, what's the geopolitical risk there?
I think that's another, we don't plan for the energy transition, but nobody's planning for migration. And that will, of course, continue to grow.
So I think understanding in the longer term demographics is linked to that. But if you look at the explosion of population that's happening in West Africa, sort of from Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and that is opportunity. And the statistics you showed, I think the profit that comes out of African air travel is tiny compared to everything else. And we heard, I think, the CEOs of Kenya Airways and Ethiopian talking about integration. So I think that points to opportunity because demographics are shifting. I mean, the demographics for China are mind-blowing. So that's a longer-term one. But the question on what I would say to airline CEOs,
yes.
I would say two things. I would say understand your exposure to secondary and tertiary sanctions enforcement, because as conflicts, I don't necessarily mean war, but heats up between the US and her allies and China, Russia, you are going to see greater enforcement of sanctions, and you need to understand that risk in your supply chain. And the second thing I would say is build scenarios. How are you successful in these possible futures? And that would be my advice to...
And that's where hedging comes in as well.
Has a situation developed? Have we reached a level of complexity for geopolitical risk in 2024, with elections, etc., that is simply going to overwhelm us?
For most companies, yes. And that's exactly the experience.
God, you must be a right at the dinner party.
No, I spend my time talking to corporate boards. I mean,
So what do you say?
Well, the thing is, everyone's playing catch-up. We all went to school when none of this happened. And so, now you've got to start reading foreign affairs and journals like this. All that political science stuff, go to hell, it's awful. So no, you've got to help people build geopolitical muscle, build their geopolitical radar. That's what you work through these days.
But I think that's exactly why, to Simon's point and Nick's point, planning, because it's so difficult right now to predict anything, and I think you mentioned earlier hedging as well. A lot of airlines, for instance, here don't necessarily believe in hedging, and again, because mark-to-market losses, and you can now just charge us more, right? However, hedging is, given fuel is such a big part of the cost, and geopolitics ultimately just shows up in fuel prices. Planning and having a kind of portfolio of some hedging activity is very, very wise.
Marie, what are you advising?
Well, I'm back on the insourcing of activities. So fuel supply, if we could insource that, that would give us control over our greatest cost component.
Delta, basically, right? Own a refinery.
Oh, no,
Yes.
we're not back to that refinery again.
Not to mention anybody in particular, but clearly, conceptually, that would be great. And I think that there are other profit-making activities that airlines should contemplate maybe insourcing.
Has the jury come back on whether that refinery was a good idea?
Last 2 years, yeah. Given where cracks have been, if you look at crack spreads versus what they could, yeah. It's not a bad investment.
Sorry, you got the last word. Go on, you're facing the board. You're facing the board. They look scared witless.
So I would pick up on Simon's point about risk overload, because I think boards are facing risk overload and they're struggling to take decisions because of all these possible futures. And this is a big year, to your point, Richard. Election, half of the world is voting. India, the United States, and more recently the UK, in a somewhat bizarre decision, is going to the polls. So I would...
Tell us what you really think.
So I would say...
Does it matter? UK's going to...
Not particularly, no. No, it doesn't really matter. But I would say, look beyond risk overload, because the point I made about opportunity, there's always opportunity out there, but you've got to understand the dynamics, and there are risks that are going to get worse, but if you get that right, then that's where you win. That's where you find the opportunity. That's trying to be uplifting at the end there.
No, thanks very much. If you get it right. Ladies and gentlemen, you can now come out from under the bedclothes and switch the light on. Thank you very much for giving us a frightening look at the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much.